the most powerful thing a teacher can do, the most powerful thing I think a teacher can do is ask a dyslexic child, what do I do that really helps you learn? Like, give me a situation where you've learned something and it's gone really well. And why has that gone really well? Because that conversation, you'll gain such an insight into how, and dyslexics are intelligent. They know how they learn best. And then you ask them the same question. What do I do that really hinders how you learn? Now, I'm not saying that you're going to be able as a teacher to implement all of those strategies, but sometimes just being aware can make such a big difference. And I just feel like dyslexics aren't listened to, like, so often. I'm Jo, and I'm from the Isle of Wight. I always feel that that's relevant to tell people. And I am a qualified primary school teacher, SENCO, specialist dyslexia, assessor and teacher, and parent of 3 children, late diagnosed dyslexic and ADHD myself, passionate about making a difference. I left education. Well, I say I left education. I still work in education, but I left working in school to set up my company another way round about 9 years ago now. And then COVID hit and online exploded. And I kind of set up this pseudo kind of like alter ego at Dyslexic Life with Jo Rees. And now apparently I do quite a lot online. So yeah, that's kind of me in a little nutshell.
You do. And I want to kind of jump in. I know we probably didn't discuss this, so don't worry, but it's about TikTok. Now, a lot of people and a lot of connections, and you've done so many amazing things and connected so many people across the globe. But TikTok, for instance, is one of the channels that you were kind of the early adopter within this side of it. I feel that there was only a couple of people within the sector that you're in that really kind of honed in on that on the social media platform, and it gave you what was that kind of journey like? Because you kind of went just from creating a couple of videos, as you mentioned, to then suddenly sort of blowing up in the sense. What was that? What was that like?
And that really did happen. So as everything with me, there's always a story. But interestingly, I was working with a mentor at the time, and she kept telling me that I needed to be on TikTok. And I was quite reluctant from the simple point of view. I didn't really understand it, but I had 3 teenagers at the time that I knew were going to be mortified if I appeared on their platform. So I was a bit kind of like wary, and from what I'd seen of it, like they sort of did like TikTok dances, or, you know, every now and again my son would send me something from a comedian that was hilarious. And I couldn't really quite get my head around how I would use it. Anyway, I used it in secret for about a month. And then this particular Saturday I created, and it was literally a 12-second video, and it was 4 things that dyslexia was not. And I filmed it in the car while waiting for one of my kids to come out from the cafe that they were working in. Anyway, I get home and my son sidles into my office and he was like, "Mum, just so you know, that you've posted a video on TikTok and it's got 10,000 views." And I was like, "Oh no, like, how do you know?" And he went, "Well, it's come up on my For You page." And I was like, "What is the For You page?" And he was like, "Well, it's the page that everybody can see you." So I was like, "Please don't tell Enid that I'm on there. Like, please don't tell your sister." Anyway, by the end of the day, that particular video had like 50,000 views, and all of the kids like had worked out that I was on there. And it's quite cool because Mum had this video that had gone kind of viral. But they were also quite sweet because they were like, "Mum, when anything goes viral, you have to be really mindful of the trolls and the hate that you're going to get, because it's going to reach people that don't really reach you." So yeah, that was the start of the TikTok journey. Now they think it's quite cool, luckily.
So you surpassed from being like, "Oh, Mum," to now like, "My mum's really cool." Yeah. But you have, I mean, you know, when we talk of kind of numbers, of views that you've had and the community you've built is massive, isn't it?
Yeah. So
I say personally.
yes. Yeah, it is. It is big, I think, for such a niched topic, because I literally do just talk about dyslexia. Like, there's the odd video on there of what I've been up to, but I've very much kind of stayed authentic to my topic. So sometimes when people get a lot of followers, they sort of go sideways and might be using TikTok Shop, might be talking about other things. But it's been really important to me that I continue to show up from a dyslexic perspective. So given that dyslexia is all I talk about, it's a very engaged community. And that would be the other thing I would say. Like, so often people chase numbers and they chase followers. And whilst it's lovely to have a video that goes viral, and that's when you get an influx of followers, and that's where people find you. You can't necessarily connect with them in the same way. And what I would say is I've built a following of people that I have genuine connection with, like the same people comment on my videos. I receive lots of messages, lots of emails from people saying, oh, yeah, you've summed me up again. Like, well done. Like, I feel like it is quite a tight-knit community that I've built and created.
And I think that's that. You answered the question I was going to ask in the sense of how important it is. No, but it's how important it is to kind of stick to your core message of what it is that you're doing, and it is very easy. With social media, it can just go wild anyway, and there's trends that people jump on, and we are I guess chasing that kind of algorithm in some aspects and thinking, but it does get very confusing. And I think what you've done over the years is being really, really powerful and really noble. Is you've stuck to what it is your message is, and who it is that you want to serve within this, and how you can help your community. And I think that's testament to what you've done. And I remember you saying, sometimes, Darren, if our conversation, sometimes if I just reach one or two people and I make a difference, then that's okay. But I mean, do you feel that do you feel a bit of a pressure sometimes that you have when you have such a big following on a certain platform? Do you feel a certain pressure within to show up, or how to kind of the message that you give? Have you ever felt that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I'm not feeling particularly great at the moment. I've had a cold, and it's interesting. I haven't really posted, and I think there is almost sometimes oh my goodness, I haven't shown up. Do I need to keep showing up? But actually, I think for me, it's been really important to remain authentic to who I am. So I try really hard to share balanced content. So why ultimately, my purpose for showing up, and somebody asked me just last week, why did you post your first ever video? And, my purpose for showing up was to raise awareness of what dyslexia looks like, because dyslexia often doesn't look like what people looks like. People think it looks like me. It looks like you. Like, what does it really mean to be dyslexic? So I think sometimes there's a pressure to just share the good stuff, possibly. But I feel like it's really important that I share the bad stuff. And whilst in order to do that, you have to be vulnerable. And I definitely think there's a balance. I have shared videos of me crying sometimes when I've had a really bad dyslexic day, because that's what it's like sometimes. Like, it is, I manage it super positively and super well. But I don't want people to think, because sometimes when they see, so like if I was to get a new follower now, sometimes I will get a message saying, but it's really easy for you. And actually, no, it's not really easy for me. The difference is I've made a choice to not be defined by what I can't do. And I try really hard to define myself by what I can do. And in order to manage that, sometimes we have to acknowledge the tricky times, but we can learn from those, like what showed up in that time, or what was happening at that time that impacted how I responded in that way. And interestingly, it's Dyslexia Awareness Week this week and Dyslexia Awareness Month. So I decided I've created an online program called the Dyslexia Accelerator Pack. And I'm actually chartering my journey across October of how I'm managing dyslexia on a day-to-day basis, and people can sign up for that. But what I'm trying to show is the learnings and how I manage dyslexia on a day-to-day basis in a much more in-depth way than you perhaps always can on social media. Absolutely. But I would always say, you want to watch the really insightful stuff, you've got to find the stuff that's got the least amount of views. because I often find stuff that goes viral is not always clickbait as such, but it can be really helpful, but it's not necessarily deep and meaningful. So, like, there's lots of videos of mine that have had lots of views where I'm literally just listing symptoms or traits of dyslexia. But actually, sometimes if you want to dig really deep into something, it's going to be a video that isn't necessarily going to have a mass watch, but it's going to resonate with people. So I always say to people, you want the good stuff, you find the stuff that hasn't got as many views, because that's where often the real value is.
Absolutely. I think that's when you build your tribe, your community, and then people can kind of pick and choose what it is, and I guess that journey that you take them on, and I think over the years, if you're not new to social media, but if you're new to suddenly getting a big following, it can you have to kind of control it in a certain way, but then you start thinking, okay, so maybe that works, so I must do content just about that. And what I love about what you've done is that you've really kind of just gone, do you know what, this is my message, this is what I'm going to be putting out, whether it gets 50,000, 1.2 million views, 100 views, 2 views, this is what I feel at this time that I think is relevant to put out to my community.
Yeah
That's it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's always interesting. I know we're going to talk about parenting in a minute, but for me, so I'm on most social media platforms, and I've had to think really carefully about how I use social media platforms because I'm a parent and because I've got children. I was thinking about this recently because I do talk about my children a lot in what we do, but they've got quite strict boundaries in as much as one of them really doesn't want to be seen on TikTok, which is absolutely fine. Some of them will come on TikTok with me depending on what it is. Some of them are happy to be used on other platforms. But that has been interesting because I wonder if they were younger, if this had happened to me when they were younger, I don't think it would have been as easy to talk about them because we would have been much more in the moment with it. Whereas often a lot of it now is anecdotal or kind of looking back. So we can manage that in a slightly different way. But that in a way has almost been more difficult to negotiate and balance than working out what I want to share, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, when I think it's kind of, when we talk about going networking or something, and people say, I can talk about a business or I can talk about this, but if I have to stand up and do 60 seconds to talk about myself, or, and then if you think, actually, I need to talk about my children, or it does add a certain nuance of kind of like, oh my God, what does that entail, and how is that going to land with them, and what does that look like? So yeah, I can see it is a bit of a a bit of a minefield within that aspect. With regards to kind of get into kind of dyslexic parenting then. So you are a mother of
3
children, and tell me a little bit about what does dyslexic parenting look like for
Well, I don't really know what normal parenting looks like in as much as I just know how to be a dyslexic parent. But I think, so for me, my journey has been super interesting because I was a parent before I got my diagnosis. So I didn't get diagnosed until I was 34. And at that point, I had done GCSEs, I had done A levels. I was the first person in my family to get a degree. I was a qualified primary school teacher. I was a qualified SENCO and an experienced and well, good. I don't like blowing my own trumpet, but I was a good SENCO. And I still didn't really know what dyslexia was, if I'm really honest. Because as a teacher, and this is relevant because this is going to all tie back really nicely to the Isle of Wight conference. As a teacher, you actually have really minimal training on what dyslexia is. And because on a teacher training course, you're learning how to be a teacher. You're learning how to plan. You're learning how to manage a class full of children. So for me, when my son started school and he started to struggle, I had done all of my training by that point, suspected I was dyslexic, knew it ran in families, had already diagnosed my dad. He was the first person I did the practice assessment on, and suspected that he was dyslexic. And interestingly, my first reaction was not to get him a diagnosis. My first reaction was to get my own diagnosis, because I felt like if I could understand how, if I was, and whilst I suspected I was dyslexic, I wasn't 100% sure. If I'm really honest, there was a bit of me, until the assessor actually told me, there was a bit in my head of, what if I'm just stupid? You know, what if I'm just not very clever? But I think for me, I wanted my diagnosis because I wanted to really understand, A, if I was dyslexic or not, but B, I know you know me quite well, but I'm quite a reflective person. And I was like, if I can work out how it showed up in me, how it's impacting itself in me in terms of the day-to-day life, then I am going to be able to support my children, my son, in the best possible way. And at the time, he was 5, my middle one was 3, and my youngest was a baby. So I didn't suspect that the girls were going to be dyslexic, particularly at that point. So that was the very start of my journey. Now, I would also say I had counselling and I had therapy, because I really felt like if I wanted to be the best parent I could possibly be, I needed to understand all of my weaknesses, all of the things that were potentially real stories, fake stories. I needed to really get my head around those in order to support them going forward. So I guess that's where my dyslexic, if you like, parenting journey kind of began.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jo. How important do you think it is for independence and kind of the life skills and the growing, the skills that you can kind of pass on to your children to be able to be confident in what, the next step of their journey, or even their current step.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, because for me, when I look back, dyslexia did show up in education, but it didn't impact itself in my attainment as such, in as much I was an average attainer. I actually think if I'd have had extra time, I'd have got much, much, much higher grades. But interestingly, it hadn't necessarily impacted my attainment as such, but it had hugely impacted my confidence and my self-esteem and my self-worth. I really didn't feel like I was clever. I really didn't feel like I was a good parent. I really didn't feel like I was good at adulting. So, my third child came along, and what I realized, my son started school and he was struggling. And what I realized was, with every child that came along, the strategies that I was using were becoming less and less efficient. And I was becoming more and more and more visible. So, for example, one of my strategies was, I had a very small social circle of friends. I really had lots of strategies to support my working memory. But all of a sudden, you've got 3 children, 3 parents' evenings you've got to remember. 3 lots of dinner money, lunch boxes. That one's got a party, but that one hasn't. They've got a dance class. What time is that? So for me, what I found was actually dyslexia was impacting everyday life for me way more than it was impacting kind of the educational side. Now, I came from a family that didn't particularly push academia, and it wasn't important to me that my children were really high flyers. It was important to me. You ask any parent just wants their child to be happy, and we want them to fulfill their potential. And I worked out really quite quickly, accidentally, that the way to support my kids was not to give them more of the thing that they were finding more difficult, but to skill them up for everyday life and to find ways to support dyslexia at home. So very quickly I sussed out that the girls were. And it's never been a thing, in as much as they've never gone up a year and I've had to go to teacher, oh, my child's dyslexic, they need X, Y, and Z. And we can talk about that a bit later on. For me, I've never had any expectations of schools, and we can talk about why that is. But for me, I really looked at how I could use life skills to develop their literacy skill, but also their independence. Because education, emptied their self-esteem bucket. And that's not a criticism of their schools and their teachers. I think they did an amazing job. But you'll know, Darren, you've been through school. When you're dyslexic, every day you're being measured, you're being compared, you're asking to regurgitate knowledge through literacy skill, which is the thing that you don't find tricky. So even with the best teachers in the world, and I was very lucky, they did have some very good teachers, they were by the end of the week, they were burnt out, they were exhausted, and their self-esteem buckets were a little bit deflated. So I saw my role as a parent, even though I had the specialist skills to be able to support them, I saw my role as filling up their self-esteem bucket. So what are you really good at? Where can you experience some success? And that is how they got through education. And really interestingly, the literacy skill followed because they had a purpose, you know. And I'll use, my son is happy for me to use him as an example. So he was really good at music. He enjoyed music. And he was really resilient with music. And from the age of 10, he wanted to be in the Royal Marines Band. You know, we took him to watch a concert. We would take him to things that would inspire him. And my husband took him to watch the Royal Marines Band at the Royal Albert Hall. And he came out and he said, one day I'm going to be in that band. I'm going to play my trumpet and I'm going to be in that band. And we were like, amazing, like that's really good. But to do that, you're going to need to get your maths and English GCSE. So it kind of gave him a purpose and a reason to do the homework. Ironically, he got in and then he decided he didn't want to go because he realized that the world was a bigger place. But that's okay, because the trumpet gave him a purpose. You know, that goal gave him a purpose to show up in education and do his best. The other thing, and if you've listened to me talk, I've talked about this hundreds of times, but, you know, using things like his trumpet, we were able to support with maths. And people go, well, what on earth do you mean? Well, you know, he wanted to take exams. He couldn't naturally read music. He learned actually to play by ear. Reading music was tricky for him. He could do it, but it took a lot of effort. So when it came to learning scales, he found that really tricky. But because he enjoyed it, because he could see a purpose, he was super motivated. He would have a whole bank of strategies he would use. He would practice. He would YouTube if he couldn't remember. He would write them down. He would ask the teacher to play them. He would record them. He'd ask his dad, because his dad was a trumpet player. Like, there were a whole range of strategies he could draw on independently to help him practice that skill. So one day when he was having a bit of a wobble over maths and he couldn't work out how to do this process, and he was saying, oh, I'm just so stupid because I can't remember how to do it. And why can't I remember it? I was able to say, right, let's just think about when you were learning that scale the other day. Could you play it the minute you picked it up? And he was like, well, no, I had to practice it. Okay, so this maths is exactly the same. Like, sometimes we just have to practice things. It doesn't come straight away. So I was like, come on, what strategies did you use to learn to play that scale? And he was able to like list them off. Or, well, maybe I might need to ask my teacher tomorrow, but I could see if I could find a YouTube video. I think it's all about giving them autonomy so that they feel independent. I think it's got to feel like it's not being done to them, and that they've got a purpose and a reason for kind of tapping into things and giving things a go. So that was our approach, really, in a nutshell.
Absolutely, and I love that, because what the amount of life skills to be able to do that is phenomenal. Because the most easiest thing to do is to just say I can't do it and just stop, and then it's almost like whoosh, the problem is now over to you in that sense. And I think, you know, what you're saying, I'm not putting words in your mouth, is kind of, you know, that it's having that ability to just sort of turn around and go, actually, yep, there is a problem, and we're not saying that you have to solve it, but you have to have some thought patterns and some strategies around to how you could possibly solve it within the side of it. And I know that you recently created an incredible course which helps you know, parents with children around strategies. And one of the things, and we'll share this as well if anyone's, you know, when people listen to this is phenomenal, because I didn't even think about things like washing, for instance, and because if you would tell your child or your teenager or anything like this, do the washing, well, you know, it would be, first of all, it would be a chore. So you'd be, oh, my goodness. But when we were discussing this, the amount of life skills that comes in to doing washing, and you'll explain this better to me, but it was around kind of the labels and the temperatures and the colors and that. What was that? What? Because I know you've got an
there's been many, this is going to sound bizarre, but there's been many situations, and one literally yesterday, where my children have been superheroes, and I don't really like using the word superhero, but like they have been able to solve situations with friends because they know how to do washing or they know how to read a label. So the first was when my son was in year 6 and he went on the residential, and they turned up at this place and nobody had the duvets were on the bed and they had to put the duvet covers on. And he literally just started putting a duvet cover on in his pillows, and everyone was like, how do you know how to do that? And I taught them how to change a bed at about 7 or 8 years old. Like, that's not that they did it all the time, but they just learned how to do that. If I, because I always worked, I was like, oh, actually, can you just strip your bed and pop it in the washing machine? And then labels, knowing how to read labels. I mean, it's just, there's so much language involved. But, it's knowing what can go in the tumble dryer and what can't. And interestingly, my daughter, who's now 18, has just headed off to university. And she texted me yesterday and she was like, oh, I was having to tell everybody else in my house that, like, you have to look at the label and you can't necessarily put it all together and on temperatures and stuff. So, yeah, joking apart, like it sets them apart.
Coming up. So, guys, it's the Isle of Wight conference, and I want to share a little bit of information about it for you.
We can now officially say that the Isle of Wight 2025 Dyslexic Life with Jo Rees conference is next month, November the 13th to be precise. And looking back at the success of last year's conference really does make me excited for this year. We've already sold over half the tickets, with 2/3 of island schools attending, 5 off-island provisions and more tickets left to sell. It promises to be an incredible day, with talks on SEND in general, dysgraphia, ADHD and dyscalculia. We truly cannot wait to see you there.
And if you think, like, we both know that travelling as dyslexics is really stressful. Like, and again, I am such an anxious traveller. I'm much better now. I understand how dyslexia shows up for me and how ADHD impacts that. I've got 1,000,001 strategies in place, but I was determined that wasn't going to make my children's world small. And actually, let's be honest, reading timetables is really, it's a skill, like, and it's tricky, and there are strategies for sure. So, all of my children are confident travellers, can read bus timetables, know how to download apps, and that was important to me. And you can teach so much language and literacy skill through that.
What do you think we can do more in schools to be able to support a child's confidence, I guess, when we're talking about dyslexia with children?
How long have you got? I think for me, I think the fundamental flaw, and joking apart, it's a short answer, because I just don't think the curriculum is dyslexic friendly. Like, the exam based, we've got rid of coursework for most subjects. Like, it shuts a dyslexic's creative strengths down at such an early age, I feel. And it's one of the reasons why I've never really had any expectations from school. And I don't mean that in an unpleasant or ignorant way, but having been in a class, having been a teacher, having been a SENCO, and knowing what teachers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, knowing the lack of training that they have on dyslexia, knowing the pressures of the curriculum and Ofsted, the pull on their resources and their budget, they have to deliver what they're told to deliver. And for me, it was about looking at what I needed to do as a parent to kind of bridge that gap and find another way around it. But I think, for me, if teachers, the most powerful thing a teacher can do, the most powerful thing I think a teacher can do, is ask a dyslexic child, what do I do that really helps you learn? Like, give me a situation where you've learned something and it's gone really well, and why has that gone really well? Because that conversation, you'll gain such an insight into how, and dyslexics are intelligent, they know how they learn best. And then you ask them the same question, what do I do that really hinders how you how you learn. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to be able as a teacher to implement all of those strategies, but sometimes just being aware can make such a big difference. And I just feel like dyslexics aren't listened to. Like, so often, you know, I had a bit of an interesting conversation with a teacher recently where, you know, well, you know, of course a child is going to say they need that, and why is the child going to know what they need? You know, and it's almost like, actually, even from a really early age, kids have a voice. Like, they know what does and doesn't work for them. They know what they enjoy. They know what they find more difficult. And actually, I think having that autonomy to just kind of feel like your voice is valued. I think so often dyslexics in the classroom feel like their voice isn't valued. And by accident, I created quite a powerful post that I'm actually going to turn into static. And it was sort of a story post, and it started off with saying, I see you, the dyslexic in the back, you know, with two voices in their head, the whisper that says, I don't think you're right, or I've got a really good idea, or I think I can solve that quickly. But then the roar of, but what if I make myself look silly? What if I embarrass myself? What if I've misunderstood? And I think that comes from classrooms, because dyslexics often don't have a positive experience in the classroom. And that isn't a teacher's fault. It's because you have to jump through academic hoops. In year 4, you have to know your times tables in 30 seconds or whatever it is. And it's not a conducive way for dyslexics to learn. And it actually ends up with lots of dyslexics feeling like they're not clever and they're not intelligent. You know, and in my one-to-one coaching program, I feel like I'm dropping everything in here, and I'm not doing that intentionally. But, you know, in my one-to-one coaching program, I created that because so many people say to me, I don't have any strengths. Like, I don't have any strengths. I'm not good at anything. And we overthink strengths, because a strength is anything you are naturally good at or you enjoy. The problem is the curriculum doesn't value those strengths. So they don't measure empathy. You know, they don't measure dyslexic thinking. They don't measure problem solving. They don't measure, you know, being able to hold a conversation and talk. You know, we were having this conversation the other day, weren't we, Darren, about how actually, you know, I've got my last ones going through GCSEs now. She's going to get really good grades, but actually she has to massively over deliver to do that. You know, reading and writing literally drains her. Whereas if she could talk her understanding into something, her grades would probably be higher, but also she wouldn't be as exhausted, because writing genuinely, but you know, it's not almost accepted that you can't submit like a verbal representation of a question.
Unless it's languages or something like that.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Jo, that you know, your expectations from an educational point of view, and again, there was no correlation to anywhere in the educational system in that sense, or teachers. But you mentioned that you don't have that massive expectations within this side. If a parent's listening to this, because when we're you know, for people listening to this in the UK, we're talking about secondary school in America, high school in this sense. Let's just talk about secondary school in this sense. You know, that's 5 years with then sixth form or colleges and stuff like that. That's a long period of time to have, you know, a child in that environment, isn't it? And from a parent's point of view, what would you say in the sense of how best you can kind of support? How would you look at that? Probably from your own perspective, I say, you know, to try and support that journey, because, you know, you go into year 1 and then year 6, whatever it is now. It was year 1 to 5 in my days. But what does that look like if someone's listening to this now? Of how best would you position to try the best to try and support your child through those years?
Yeah. So when I'm saying I've got no expectations, that doesn't mean that I don't communicate with school.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and I clarify that. Yeah,
but I think it's tricky, isn't it? Because I genuinely feel that secondary teachers probably have the least amount of training when it comes to SEND. And again, this isn't a criticism. If you think many secondary school teachers go into secondary school teaching because they are passionate and experts in their subject. So their job is to impart knowledge of their subject. So if you've got a student with weak reading and spelling skill, you're not going to have a clue how to support that. at all. And that isn't their fault. You're absolutely right. It is a long time to be there. But for me, what I always did with my own children was we ran our own race, in as much as we knew which subjects were important to us. We knew which ones didn't matter as much. You're always in life going to get people that get you and get people that don't. So, you know, if you've got, so for us, it was about knowing where to put our priorities and where to put our focus and our attention, and absorbing some of those expectations from teachers. Sometimes I would have a conversation with a teacher and say, I really get that you can see my child has got massive potential in this subject, but I'm really sorry, it's just not their subject and it's not important for their next. So they are going to do the homework or whatever, but please don't be pushing them super hard, because actually this isn't important for their next step. So I would have those sorts of conversations. Things like getting hold of the key vocabulary for subjects, because dyslexic brains, if you think particularly science, let's use that for example, you know, science, it's like 3 separate languages. By the time you come to study secondary school science, there is so much vocabulary and terminology that actually, if you're not familiar with the vocabulary and the terminology, that's going to slow you down and it's going to impact how you can retain something. So, you know, getting hold of that subject specific vocabulary can be really, really helpful. The other thing I did was I always made sure that my children had an advocate in school. So the minute they move to secondary, like quite often they have they can like email teachers, can't they? And they have their own email. So the minute they went to secondary, I stopped doing the advocating for them and kind of did it alongside them to begin with. And I now only ever step in if I really need to. So, you know, if they're struggling with a piece of homework, or if, you know, they needed more help, I would sit with them and encourage them to write an email to the teacher kind of explaining that they'd found it really difficult. I think there are different ways to advocate for yourself. Occasionally it's tricky, like, so if you've got a core subject and you've got a teacher that really doesn't get your child, then you do have to have that difficult conversation that they might need to move to a different set. I think it's selecting a secondary school where you can, that plays to your child's strengths. So if you've got a child that's really good at sport, you want to try and seek out a secondary school that's got really good sports facilities. None of my children were good at sport or interested in sport, but like I think it's about finding the best fit that you possibly can and looking at what you can do rather than what you can't do. And it is a partnership with schools. So I think it's about, again, the times when I have had to challenge them. And there have only been 4 or 5 times. I've got one going in year 11 now. The other 2 are out of school. And I can honestly say there are only 4 times when I've been, and I hate the term that parent, because I think it implies that you're being difficult and you're not, because you just want the best for your child. But I can honestly say there's been 4 times when I've really had to kind of like say, actually, we're not accepting that. Like, this needs to be done instead. But for me, they didn't have masses of tuition. Like I say, for me, it was about working out what they needed to do to access their next step and take the pressure off of them. And it's really interesting. My middle one just got her A-level results. So my eldest did BTEC route. My middle one chose to do A-levels. And I'm not going to share what she got, but she did incredibly well. And it was really interesting because I had a conversation with her and she said, one of the reasons why I feel like I've done so well, Mum, is because you didn't have any expectations of me. And she said, that's not that you didn't have expectations of me, but you didn't put the pressure on me. She said, like, you encouraged me. And she said, if anything, you kind of talked me down in as much as, well, you only need this, and this to access your next step. So don't push yourself too hard. But for her, she said that really helped her kind of manage her own expectations, because she knew that she wasn't managing my expectations or her dad's expectations. Like, again, she had autonomy. She could push herself as hard as she wanted without feeling like she was going to be letting anybody down. the other thing I would say with 3 children is one size definitely does not fit all. So actually, the approaches and what you use for one child doesn't necessarily work for another. We're just navigating it again now for our third. So I think it's constantly being reflective, trying really hard not to project your experiences of education as well, because they're not you. And that is tricky because we don't want them to have the same educational experience as us. But I actually genuinely really feel for teachers, because I just don't feel like they have the skills or knowledge to support dyslexics. And again, that's not a criticism of them, but you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And this is going to segue beautifully into the conference, actually, because when I went off to do my specialist dyslexic training, I went off thinking I knew what dyslexia was, because I'd been a SENCO for 2 years. I'd done a couple of 1-hour courses or whatever. And it blew my mind what I didn't know about dyslexia. And the thing is, you don't know what you don't know. And that is what I feel about teachers. And that is what I feel about the education system. It's not a blame game. I don't blame them if they don't get something right or if they don't know something. And that's because I'm in a privileged position that I understand education because I've been a teacher and a SENCO. And that is my motivation for the Isle of Wight conference.
Which we will go on to, Jo. So tell us about, we played a little video of this the conference. You did one last year, which was a roaring success, which was a sellout, first one of its kind, and you're doing it again.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about it, Jo.
Yeah, so for me, I was actually made redundant from my specialist dyslexic post, because of budget. That's what it came down to. There was no budget for it. And I know that many local authorities don't have a specialist dyslexia service anymore. And there's just kind of been a real gap in provision for a really long time. And I'm really fortunate that I have a really good relationship with lots of the SENCOs on the Isle of Wight, lots of SENCOs all over England, but, on the Isle of Wight in particular. And I do a lot of assessment. So I kind of knew where the gaps in education were. So one week, last April 2024, I had literally a run of emails from SENCOs. Jo, what's the best screening tool? Have you heard of Morph Mastery? We're thinking of learning a bit more about it. What do you know about the new definition? Can you come and deliver some training? What do you know about dyscalculia? Can you come and deliver some training? So I was I had literally, they all came from SENCOs, and I was hot off the dyslexia show, and I thought, do you know what? I've got people in my network that I could bring to the Isle of Wight that could inspire these SENCOs that are super hungry to get knowledge. And I could do a day's conference. So I approached Hampshire Dyslexic Association, and I could not have done last year without Hampshire Dyslexia Association. So I want to give them a huge shout out because they were massively supportive. And I approached them and said, look, would you be prepared to help me fund it? I really want to create a one-day conference with these incredible speakers. I want to pay them for their time to come and speak because I appreciate their expertise. And I want to create something really, really special. We've only got about 45 schools on the island, but I think we can sell 80 tickets. And they were like, Jo, we're in, let's do it. And we literally put it together. So we talked about it in the April, May, but we didn't start selling tickets until September. And we sold it out in 8 weeks. And it was incredible. And I worried for a minute that I wasn't going to be able to recreate it. And was it just one of those one-hit wonder things? And then I look back through the feedback from the delegates from last year, and there were clear things that were identified. There was the big message was screening isn't the issue for anything, for ADHD, for autism, for dyslexia. They feel like they're pretty good. So no, they can't diagnose, but they feel like they're pretty good at working out where a child might be experiencing difficulty. Their issue, their difficulty is, so what now? I've identified them at being at risk on a screen, but what now? What do we do next? So the So What Now conference was kind of born. And I can remember having a conversation with you and saying, "Oh, I've got this wish list of speakers, but I don't know if I'm going to get them there." Anyway, I've got the wish list of speakers. So Georgina Durrant is kicking us off. She's actually joining us virtually because she's got very young children and she couldn't really be further away from the Isle of Wight. But she's going to be doing something incredibly special. We're going to be doing, people that have signed up are actually going to get the opportunity to ask her questions in a few weeks' time and help shape her talk so that her talk will be relevant to the delegates that are there. She's going to be talking about SEND strategy and what you can do. Then we've got the incredible Fintan O'Regan talking about the curious case of ADHD, giving us practical hands-on strategies to manage ADHD in the classroom. Then we've got Dr. Helen Ross back for a second year. She's talking to us about dysgraphia, because that is a sort of bit of a buzzword at the minute, but what does it actually mean? So she's talking to us about that. And then Kat, the other co-founder from the Dyscalculia Network, is going to be doing a really practical hands-on workshop using evidence-based maths approaches to support just not just learners with dyscalculia, maths development in general. And then we're also doing the round table discussions, which were really, really, really powerful last year. So the experts are there the whole day.
And when is this, Jo?
It's on the 13th of November.
And where is it, Jo?
It's at the Lakeside in Wootton on the Isle of Wight. Really easily accessible from all ferry terminals. So so we're doing, it's 125 a delegate. That's what you're going to ask me next. Is that what you're going to ask me?
I guess so.
125 a delegate, and lunch and parking is included. Like, how often do you go to a conference these days and lunch is included?
But absolutely. But I genuinely believe, you're doing an incredible thing because you're taking it somewhere, on the island, which is, a phenomenal thing that you're doing. And it's the first of its kind within that side of it. So I think, and I think that's the kind of the entrepreneurial in you in that sense. And I think it takes someone who's strong enough to go, actually, I'm just going to roll with this. I'm going to go with it. And you created an incredible event, last year. And I'm really looking forward to seeing, what this one looks like. And you have when you talk about lineup of speakers, yes, you smashed it. I remember when we had that conversation, you said I have my list, and I said, well, it's done. If you've written the list, it's done. Yeah. And then you went off and within a couple of hours you come back and said, yeah, I've done it. So I was what we're going to close the conversation now, Jo. What do you hope to see going forward with when we talk about kind of dyslexia in a whole, when we talk about kind of dyslexia parenting and support? Is it, we talk about more awareness that we need? Do you feel that we need to kind of change? I guess it's a very big question. We probably haven't got time to go into this, but kind of what would you like to see change over the next few years to be able to help and support, I guess, children within the educational system?
Yeah, so for me, can be really controversial, but for me, it's not necessarily about screening. And I can't speak for other areas. I can only speak from my area. But I actually genuinely feel like schools are quite good at screening. That isn't the issue. The issue is they don't know what to do after that because they don't have the training. But also, they don't have the budget or the resources to purchase what they need. So even if they were to go off and do a specialist course, they wouldn't necessarily have the budget to be able to buy the resources that they need. But also, how does that fit into the curriculum? Like, this is the other issue. The curriculum moves at such a fast pace that I just don't know where you would even fit that intervention into the curriculum. For me, if we're really wanting to create a dyslexic friendly environment in education, and it's not just dyslexia, it's all learning differences, it's neurodivergence in general, we need to go back to the drawing board with the curriculum. For me, the issue is not just dyslexia, it's the curriculum itself, the curriculum content and how it's delivered. Like, we know as adults, do we ever sit down? Like, we might go to a one-day conference, but do we ever go, oh, I know what I'm going to do this week. I'm going to go to 5 conferences, one after another, because I want to get as much information as possible. We would never do that as adults. Yet we expect children to go to school 5 days a week, sit down and learn by us just talking at them. And I know it's a bit more, but we're expecting them to just learn information using their auditory memory, really.
Yeah.
And it's sort of knowledge, isn't it, rather than skills. I would love to see a skills-based curriculum, because I feel like if we were developing skills, the literacy and maths would come. And I'm not anti-education. I think it's really important, and we're really fortunate in the UK that we do have a free education system. But for me, it's the curriculum. That's where I would start.
Wonderful. Jo, it's been incredible as always. Thank you so much for being a guest on Neurodiversity Stories. Apologies it's been so long. But we will definitely be asking if you can come back and share. There's so many different topics we can talk about. But thank you so much, Jo, for being an incredible guest on Neurodiversity Stories.
Thank you.